Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Battle Chasers Nightwar. Now, this game came out about 2 years ago, so it's been on my backlog for quite a while, but about a week ago I finally got around to playing it again, and I haven't been able to put it down since. Now, Battle Chasers is a turn-based RPG slash dungeon crawler, I guess you could say. And here's why. So there are three main ways on how you can traverse the world. You have your world map, where you just go from point A to point B, and along the way you can pick up treasure, loot items, or you can fight enemies, but you can also enter dungeons and exploration areas, which are the two other main ways to explore. Exploration areas in general don't have you fight enemies. There's only very select areas where you do find enemies and such, but in general you could just go there to find more about the world, go to a tavern, find a shark that wants you to go fishing, or stuff like that. In general, not much combat involved. And then of course you have your dungeons, where when you go in you get to choose a difficulty, either normal, hard or heroic. On normal and hard you can decide to pause the dungeon as well, so you can just back out, go back to the hub town to heal up and stuff like that, then go back into the dungeon with maybe a different party setup or something like that if you do think you need different characters, because you can only have up to 3 characters in your party at the same time. And then of course on heroic, which is the one difficulty where when you die you can't actually restart the dungeon. You have to, well, you actually need to restart the dungeon. You can't just go back to the hub town and continue where you left off. Now, one thing about continuing dungeons after you've taken a break is that you don't need to kill all of the enemies again or all of the loot chests, because those have all been looted out. But on the other hand, if there's any puzzles or something in the dungeon that you've done previously, you will need to complete the puzzles again, because those do reset. Now, the way how you go about this is pretty cool. So all of the characters have what are called dungeon skills. Each character has 2 different dungeon skills, and depending on the character they can have quite a big impact on how you go through these dungeons. For example, Gully, the first character that you start playing as, has a shield that allows her to take no damage from dungeon traps, for example, so you can use her to run through some traps. But on the other hand, her second ability smashes her fist on the ground, and this has 2 usages. Either you can use this to stun enemies where you go into combat so that they're stunned for the first turn, or you can use this to smash through breakable walls, which then often lead up to a treasure chest. Calibretto, the first healer that you have, for example, has a healing action when you're in the dungeon, and there's other characters as well that have very different abilities. So it basically is up to you on using the characters that have the best dungeon abilities for you for exploration or getting through the dungeon easier, or of course taking characters that will be better in combat to your liking. So in combat it's a bit different from normal turn-based games as well. So you have 3 different combat abilities. You have actions, abilities, and burst. Actions cost no mana, they're used instantly, and they will usually generate overcharge, which is a buff to your mana bar, I guess you could say. So basically, whenever you have overcharge, your overcharge gauge will be used instead of your mana gauge. Or if you don't have enough, like for example, say you have a skill that costs 20 mana, but you only have 10 overcharge, then you basically will pay 10 overcharge and 10 mana to cast that skill. Some characters also interact with this overcharge gauge to empower some of their abilities, but I'm not going to go too deep into that. Then your abilities, your second skills that you can use, these are casted abilities, so when it's your turn and you decide to use an ability, it will still take a little bit longer before you actually cast it. Depending on the ability, it will be a very fast, a fast, or a slow cast. And when you look on the left, on the, like, I guess the timer, I guess you could say, or the timeline, where you can check who is going next, you'll also see when you will be casting that ability. So say for example you want to cast a shield to prevent some damage to you, but when you do see that the shield that you want to cast is too slow, then you might as well use something else instead that might take care of the enemy or that heals up the damage beforehand or something like that. And then last but not least, you have bursts. There are 3 different bursts for each character, each for each level of burst, so there is a total of 3 levels of burst that you can have. And they can have very different abilities. For example, when we talk about Gully, her level 1 burst is a party-wide shield, her level 2 burst is a AoE stun, and her level 3 burst is a single target nuke. And then of course for all of the other characters it varies, but it's usually very versatile, I guess you could say, because that is another really cool thing. So as you level up your character, you get perk points, aka skill points. And you can spend these perks in one of two different trees, or in two different skill trees. Now, they don't work like a normal skill tree where you need to have X amount of points in the tree to unlock the next stage. They basically just unlock depending on what level you are, and each skill just requires a certain amount of points. Now, the cool thing about this is that you can reallocate your points as much as you want. And another cool thing is that this basically makes it so that you can play your character in one of two ways. If you look at Gully again, your main character, she has two different trees. One is for a DPS tree and the other is as a tank tree. So depending on the team setup that you have, you can either decide to run her as a tank or you can run her as a DPSer, or you can kind of do a mixture of both where she is tanking a little bit but also still does quite a lot of damage. And there's some characters that have a lot of versatility in them as well, like for example Alemon, which quickly is becoming one of my favorite characters. He's mainly like a DPSer, but a lot of his actions also heal the party, and some are a mixture of both, where you heal and do damage at the same time. So there's a lot of versatility in the characters, and I like that system quite a lot. And then of course, like the way that you can mix and match your teams to make dungeon exploration easier as well is really cool. Now, the dungeons themselves are pretty easy. Like the way that they're set up, like dungeons themselves aren't easy, of course. But it's pretty much what you would expect from a dungeon. You go in, you have different rooms, like kind of like a Bindings of Isaac style game, like a roguelike. Each time that you start a new dungeon run, the rooms are randomized as well, by the way. So that's something to keep in mind. Not all of the dungeons will always be the same. But when you go in, you just clear out the room, clear out all of the enemies. Then you can go and loot your chests, loot your barrels and crates and stuff like that. And then you basically just move on until eventually you find the dungeon boss, you beat the dungeon boss, and then you can go out again. One cool thing as well is before each dungeon boss there will be a red crystal, and you can use that crystal to be fully healed so that you have your maximum HP and mana going into the final boss. So you don't have to worry about spending mana potions or HP potions before the final boss, because you will be maximum HP and MP when you do reach it. Now, as you go through the dungeons, there will also be a lot of lore bits that you can discover as well. And that is something that I actually thought was really cool. So the story itself is not super amazing in my opinion. It's a pretty cliché story, I guess you could say. But on the other hand, all of the lore bits that you can find in dungeons and exploration areas do make for a pretty good read and make you pretty invested in the world. So even though the story is not crazy interesting and like out of your way, but the world building and all of the lore that you can find in the game do make it so that the world is incredibly well built, which is something that I think is a lot more important than having a pretty good story. Some of the story bits are also voice acted, although there are also a lot of things that you will have to read for yourself. In general, you're going to be reading more than you're going to be listening. So there's not a crazy amount of voice acting, but there's some of there in there, mainly for the story stuff. And then of course all of the other stuff like dialogues, lore bits, interactions with NPCs and stuff, that's usually going to be where you're gonna need to read. Now, another thing is when you find all of this lore in the dungeon, you'll often find part 1 out of 4 or something, for example, of a certain book. And then you have to discover all of the different lore bits in the dungeon before you have all 4 of them. Now, instead of just reading them in the dungeon, which is something that you can do, you can also decide to just not read them in the dungeon and read them later on inside your lore book, as you do keep track of all of the different lore bits that you found in the dungeon, and then you can read them afterwards if you're interested in them. So it's really cool. You don't necessarily get all of the lore shoved down your throat like you would with something like Pyre. Pyre is very story driven as well, but you're forced to read all of the story. So if you're somebody that is really invested in the world and the lore and all of the story and stuff, you can decide to read all of it. But if you're somebody that would rather just play for the gameplay, which is stellar as well, by the way, then you can just decide to not read the lore and just move on with your time. And then maybe say after you finally finish the game, you do want to read more and learn more about some of the characters, then you can go back to the lore book and read the specific entries that you are interested in. And that's pretty much the game. It is a pretty simple setup, but it has a lot of cool little tidbits that make it unique and make it really enjoyable to play. So that's Battle Chasers Nightwar. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.